Okay, so welcome to Chapter 4. We're going to start talking about expected inflation on NyQuil. In the last lecture, we learned about the optimal quantity of money by Milton Friedman. So we've learned a little bit about money demand, money supply, changes in the demand for money, changes in the supply of money. But we haven't really talked much about expected inflation. We've learned about like actual or realized inflation, but expected inflation is a little different than that. It's you'd think it's like, okay, well, it's just what we expect inflation to be. Well, what shapes that? What determines what you expect inflation to be? That's where things get interesting. How do deviations of expectations of inflation from actual inflation like matter? Like, how does this deviate from actual inflation? So, yay, my course, my way. This movie ends my way. So, inflation expectations are guided by monetary policy. Whenever the Federal Open Market Committee chair makes an announcement about plans for monetary policy, they usually discuss their decision over the federal funds rate. Like, the committee has gotten together and we've decided that we're going to raise the federal funds rate by usually like 25 basis points, or we're going to lower it by like 25 basis points. Lately, if they ever lower it, it's more like they just say, screw it, we're going to lower it straight to zero, whatever it is, straight to zero. Let's hope that doesn't ever happen again, at least anytime soon. So they discuss their decision over the federal funds rate, like what they decided, and then they'll kind of discuss like their plans, right? How they expect changes in the federal funds rate to affect real economic activity and why they're doing what they're doing. So if, say, inflation is really high, they're going, we want to get inflation low again. What are we going to do? We're going to raise the federal funds rate. If you raise the federal funds rate, inflation will eventually begin to tick back down. It might take a while because there are, quote, long and variable lags of monetary policy. So it's not like if you raise the Fed funds rate today, tomorrow the inflation rate goes down. It could be a couple months before you really see a change in inflation given a change to the Fed funds rate. But again, here's the thing, right? We're changing a nominal variable, the federal funds rate. It's a nominal interest rate. And we need to affect a real variable. Well, if you look at the Fisher equation relates the real and the nominal interest rate by really just adding inflation to the real rate, and that gives you the nominal rate. But think about it like this. Don't think about it just in terms of inflation anymore. Think about it in terms of expected inflation. So the real interest rate would be equal to the nominal rate minus the expected inflation rate. And that's telling us what the real interest rate is. So if interest rates get cut, what's happening is the Fed is increasing the monetary base, right? If the Fed increases the money base, this increase in the monetary aggregate leads to an increase in prices. And if prices increase, that leads to an increase in inflation. So if the Fed comes out and they announce their policy and the public expects inflation to be something like what the Fed said, well, what does that mean about expected inflation? What happens is that the Fed is guiding the public's expectations for inflation. So what does the Fed want to do about inflation? Well, they want to keep inflation at or around an average rate of about 2% per year. This is the core and the headline PCE price indices from 2014 up to the end of 2023. Okay. Core PCE has, at least up until 2020, been a little closer to 2%. It's been, up until 2020, it was almost consistently below 2%, save just this one little time period here. Right? I think it was like, early 2019, late 2018, something like that. But it was between 1% and 2%. And then, COVID hits, and that was a complete disaster. Massive expansionary monetary policy. And, as they increased the money base, Who would have thought that inflation increased as a result? Hmm. It's almost as if like Milton Friedman was right. Huh. Yeah, who would have thought about that? Anyways, so, okay, maybe they haven't been all that good at keeping it at or around an average of 2%, because even leading up to 2020, you had a few periods where headline PCE is above 2%, but there's still way more periods where it's way below 2%. Now, what's the difference between core and headline PCE? You're probably scratching your head right now, wondering what the difference is. Well, headline PCE is like there's a basket of goods, and they want to see what the prices are of those goods. Well, with headline PCE, you have things like gas prices and food prices. Core PCE strips that out. Why would it strip that out? Why would we care about not looking at food and energy prices? Well, food and energy prices are particularly volatile, especially over the short run, like really short run, like month to month. The Fed is a little bit more concerned with like medium to like long run inflation here. And they don't want to look at like weird blips like white noise. Maybe not white noise. Maybe that's not the best word to use. They don't want to look at huge swings in something that can move very quickly, that can also move as a result of something that's like not monetary policy related. So they strip that out and they get a slightly smoother estimate of inflation. And by getting that slightly smoother estimate of inflation, that makes it a little bit easier for them to gauge where their monetary policy decisions need to go. Because if you have something that's bouncing up and down, it's going all over the place like this, that's going to make monetary policy decisions very, very difficult. Because, again, there are long and variable lags of monetary policy. If you're like, okay, wow, headline PCE inflation gets almost down to 0 at one point. That's really not good, right? That's bad. That's really bad. What are we going to do? Well, we'd have to really, really, really cut interest rates. Oh, wait. Well, at this point, interest rates are pretty much at 0 anyways, right? Well, that's not very good. I guess they're starting to hike them around here. So that's not really very good. Well, okay, I guess increase the money base some more. Maybe that'll do it. Well, okay. Could give you like a huge spike. It could bring inflation all the way up to here. And then you're like, oh my God, that got really, really high. Cut interest rates. But you start doing this really drastic, like overcorrecting type behavior, trying to adjust something for trying to keep something within like, a decent range that isn't really even necessarily a factor or a function of purely what you're doing with your monetary policy. So look at core PCE, right? That strips out the volatile food and energy prices. It gives them a better idea. It's a little bit more stable. It gives them something a little bit better of an idea of what they need to be looking at in order to try to gauge where inflation might actually be. Because remember, both of these are estimates of inflation. Any price index you look at is an estimate for inflation. Okay, so if the Fed were sticking to their plans, and they actually stuck to their plans to achieve a low inflation rate, they'd want to keep the inflation rate so that banks can set interest rates for loans conditional on where they expect inflation to go during the length of that loan. Because if inflation increases before the loan matures, then the bank loses money, and that's not good for the bank, right? So let's say you write a loan for, say, 2%. Inflation's currently 1%, so the real return you'd get would be 1%, right? Well, what happens if there's a huge jump in inflation where inflation is now like 3%? Well, your real return is now -1 instead of 1%. So you need to have a pretty good idea about where inflation is going to go in the future before you make a loan. Because if inflation goes up before the loan matures, and it goes up at a rate that's higher than the nominal interest rate that you quoted on that loan, you're going to end up losing money. So the Fed wants to be able to guide the public's expectations about inflation for the future. And the more stable the policy the public expects, the more stable their behavior is going to be. If you got a lot of volatility in the expected inflation rate, that's not really very good, right? If you expect inflation to go from 2% this year to 5% next year and back down to 2% the following year, Well, your spending behavior is going to go haywire. The amount that banks are lending is not really going to be very good. The economy is there will be a lot of uncertainty in the economy. It won't be all that great. So the Fed can consistently communicate their plans for inflation. And if they do so, the public is going to be less likely to react to a short-run spike in inflation due to, say, some non-monetary shock. If there's a hike in food or energy prices, for example. So going back to the core and headline PCE, right? If headline PCE spikes, but the Fed is consistently communicating their plans for inflation, what they plan to do to keep inflation stable, then the Fed is anchoring expected inflation. Yeah. If inflation expectations get anchored, then the economy is more likely to be stable, because think about how your spending behavior would change if you expected inflation to go really high in the near future. If you expect inflation to go up to 10% next year, what are you going to do? You're going to spend, well, not all of your money, but you're going to spend a lot of your money today because it's not going to be worth anything in the future. So you're like, screw it. I'm just going to spend a lot more right now. And then it kind of, unfortunately, becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because, well, your money's important to you. It's very important to the IRS as well. And like I said, you'd be changing how you spend your money depending on what you think prices are going to be in the future. If you want to buy a new car, and let's say you're like, hey, I really want this new car, but I want to wait maybe until next year to do it. Maybe I'm not in the best financial position to get this car that I want. But then you find out prices of cars are going to go up 30%. Are you going to wait, or are you going to say, screw it, take your chances and buy it now? More likely to say screw it and buy it now, because you'd rather finance a car that's 30% less than what it's going to be a year from now. So if expected inflation goes up, spending goes up, and then it drives inflation up, and it becomes that self-fulfilling prophecy. If we're going to quote former Fed Chair Ben Bernanke, best one of my lifetime, the extent to which inflation expectations are anchored can change depending on economic developments and the current and past conduct of monetary policy. In this context, I use the term anchored to mean relatively insensitive to incoming data. So, for example, if the public experiences a spell of inflation higher than their long-run expectation, but their long-run expectation of inflation changes little as a result, then inflation expectations are well anchored. If the public the public reacts to a short period of higher than expected inflation by marking up their long-run expectation considerably, then expectations are poorly anchored. So what happens if expected inflation goes up? Well, we get an increase in the nominal interest rate and the opportunity cost of holding money, which then leads to a decrease in the demand for money. Why is that? Well, if we look at equation 2, we've got the demand for money as a function of income and the nominal interest rate. But the nominal interest rate is equal to the real rate plus expected inflation. So what we can do is we can replace that RT term, the capital RT, with lowercase r plus expected inflation. And that gives us equation 3. So if expected inflation goes up and there's no change in the real interest rate, then the nominal interest rate goes up. But since money demand is decreasing in the real interest rate, a higher interest rate means a reduction in the demand for money. The increase in expected inflation will increase the price level, which reduces the real quantity of money. Now, neither inflation nor expected inflation are any good. But what's really, really bad is when expected inflation deviates from actual or realized inflation. So suppose inflation expectations are at like 2% per year, and we have an increase in expected inflation. What happens? Well, it drives up expected inflation. Expectations are no longer anchored. Workers want higher wages to be able to cover the expected rise in prices. So let's say they actually get lucky, their bosses listen to them and give them more pay. As a result of that increase in costs that firms have to face, because, labor is a cost to the firm, they raise their output prices, causing like a cost push inflation. So the increase in expected inflation becomes that self-fulfilling prophecy. If inflation expectations increase, it's hard to bring inflation down. This is what the U.S. saw in the late 1970s when we had high unemployment and high inflation. It's what's known as stagflation. Because when we get to the Phillips curve in a little bit, you'll see that there's a trade-off. There's like an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. If unemployment is low, well, let's say unemployment's high, you can raise inflation to bring unemployment back down. So usually high inflation means low unemployment. High unemployment generally means low inflation. But if they're both high, then you got a problem. That's what's known as stagflation. But there's problems with inflation being persistently lower than the target as well. And that's because, well, banks make loans, and the interest rates they compute are based on the expected rate of inflation over the life of the loan. So if nominal interest rates are really low, like they were in the U.S. for a very long time, and it's saying and hopefully being raised a bit soon. I actually made this lecture a couple years ago before they raised interest rates, and I kind of forgot to take that part out. Sorry. The lower rate of inflation will keep interest rates even lower. And since the Fed operates monetary policy by influencing interest rates, if interest rates are low as a result of low expected inflation, well, there's not a whole lot they can do to try to stimulate the economy in a recession. Because if we go into a recession, interest rates are already low and they're bound below by zero. You can't really lower them anymore. So to quote Jerome Powell on expected inflation, who was not my favorite Fed chair, inflation that runs below its desired level can lead to an unwelcome fall in longer-term inflation expectations, which in turn can pull actual inflation even lower, resulting in an adverse cycle of ever lower inflation and inflation expectation. The dynamic is a problem because expected inflation feeds directly into the general level of interest rates. Well-anchored inflation expectations are critical for giving the Fed the latitude to support employment when necessary without destabilizing inflation. But if inflation expectations fall below our 2% objective, interest rates would decline in tandem. In turn, we would have less scope to cut interest rates to boost employment during an economic downturn, further diminishing our capacity to stabilize the economy through cutting interest rates. We've seen this adverse dynamic play out in other major economies around the world and have learned that once it sets in, it can be very difficult to overcome. We want to do what we can to prevent such a dynamic from happening here. He's very long-winded in not saying all that much. But he's a lawyer. What do you expect? Let's look at actual versus expected inflation. For actual inflation, we use core PCE inflation, and it's the inflation rate that's used by the Federal Reserve. This uses a chain-weighted price index, but it leaves out food and oil prices. Again, like I said, to reduce volatility in the inflation rate because the Fed's a little bit more concerned with long-run inflation and less so with like short-run stuff. Food and gas prices can be pretty volatile in the short run. Now, to compute expected inflation, what we use is the 10-year break-even inflation rate. And this inflation rate gives us a measure of expected inflation derived from 10-year treasuries. These are constant maturity securities and the 10-year Treasury inflation indexed constant maturity security. And what happens is these values tell us what market participants expect inflation to be in the next 10 years on average. So if I plot out headline PCE inflation, core PCE inflation, and this 10-year expected inflation break-even rate, this is what we see. What's in green is expected inflation, and what is in blue is the one that we're really concerned about. It's core PCE inflation. You can see that generally speaking, they're within a percent of each other. Sometimes they're really, really close. Other times, they deviate a little bit, but it's like within a percent or so. But we get to 2021 when inflation really begins to spike in the U.S. And the 10-year break-even rate starts to tick up a little bit. Now, that was kind of scary because that's telling us, inflation expectations are starting to become unanchored. They were anchored as this is going up. It's basically, everybody's going, it's not going to last forever. It's not going to be a huge thing. But as it starts to tick up, you start to get really scared. You're like, oh, boy, as this starts ticking up right here, you're like, this is not good. Expected inflation starting to go up. What if it continues to go up? Well, persistently high expected inflation is not good, just like persistently low expected inflation is not good either. So we can see overall, though, that expected inflation is much more stable than actual inflation. It's smoother than actual inflation. And according to Bernanke, if expected inflation is relatively unchanged relative to actual inflation, then we can gather that inflationary expectations are well anchored. So even now, inflation expectations are still well anchored. Thank God on that one. Currently, inflation expectations are still low, despite the fact that we still have higher than desired actual inflation. So, I've learned a lot about what expected inflation is. How do we compute it? Well, we need to do a few things to be able to do it. First, we need to know about TIPS. What are TIPS? Well, TIPS are Treasury Inflation Protected Securities. These are securities that are indexed for inflation so that you don't lose out on any money. It's going to have a yield, say, R pi, that increases when inflation increases and decreases when inflation decreases. And you get paid out the principal balance that's adjusted for it. It's really kind of cool when you think about it. So it's like you can buy a treasury and then it is protected from the effects of inflation. So we can use that treasury yield, the TIPS yield, and the normal treasury yield, just call it RT, and we can take the difference between the two, and that's going to give us expected inflation. So why would this be a good measure of expected inflation? Well, the TIPS value adjusts after the CPI adjusts. So it gives people a semi-annual interest payment that's got a fixed rate, and the interest payment is found by using the adjusted value of the bond. So payment goes up with inflation. The money that you get is the original amount adjusted for inflation. So it's like the nominal amount changes, but the real amount is the same. And the coupon rate is the real return, like the return above inflation. So typical treasury notes don't have inflation protection built into them because they're exposed to the effects of inflation, right? And because they're exposed to the effects of inflation, they're going to demand a higher interest rate as a hedge against inflation. But TIPS, on the other hand, they're less risky. So if there's less risk, you're going to have a lower interest rate because you don't need to hedge against inflation because it's kind of already adjusted for that. So the interest rate on the TIPS yield is going to go up and down a little bit, whereas the typical treasury note yield doesn't. It'll be constant. Now, another way to compute expected inflation would be like a sum of probabilities. Think like you've got like two possible states of the economy. There's like a low inflation possibility and a high inflation possibility. The low inflation, 2%, has a probability of 1/2. So it's a 50% probability. There's also a 50% probability where inflation is 5%. Each probability is, 1/2. So the sum of the probabilities is 1, right, which is what it's supposed to be. So what we're going to do is we're just going to weight each state of inflation by its respective probability and then sum that up. So I get 1/2 times 2 plus 1/2 times 5. All right, well, that gives me 2 over 2 plus 5 over 2 is 7 over 2, which is 3.5%. So expected inflation in this case is 3.5%. So a more formal way to write it, given a set of probabilities P sub I, where you have the sum as I goes from 1 to n of P sub I equals 1, and a possible state of inflation in each case, then expected inflation would be the sum of the probabilities weighted by the inflation in each case. So you sum them up, and that's going to give you a measure of expected inflation. Now, this is derived a little differently than what we saw in the previous form because it's giving us a different measure of inflation, and it's measuring a different thing, actually. So TIPS spreads give us a measure based on observed CPI fluctuations. So this is based on already estimated, like what we just did, this method right here. This method is based on already estimated scenarios for how the economy might evolve. TIPS yields aren't doing that. TIPS yields are kind of like, well, this is where things are. The sum of probabilities method is giving us scenarios on the possible states of the economy. Now, when we're doing like financial or economic forecasting, modelers will be developing certain scenarios based on possible states of the economy. It's actually how like stress tests for the banks work. Regulators will design these scenarios. Banks then have to show, based on these scenarios, that they can withstand these scenarios. So if you've got a series of cases derived from other models and an estimated probability attached to each one, then you can sum the product of these probabilities with each state, and that gives you a measure of expected inflation. So this wraps up the lecture. We talked about expected inflation, why it's important, all that fun stuff. What happens if it's not anchored, and how to compute it. So, yeah, that wraps up expected inflation, and thank you for watching. The next lecture is going to cover bonds and the term structure of interest rates. So, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time when we talk about bonds.